Hello, everybody. I'm Sam Staley. Some of you I don't know, some of you we've met over the years, but because I've been coming on and off to the American Dream Coalition Conference for a number of years. Actually, I was at the first one.
I think you've been mostly on, actually.
Mostly on,
yeah.
until I moved to Florida State, in which I became a little off for a little while. Of course, the faculty, of course,
Just don't go any farther that way.
Okay,
or you're gonna
okay,
step
so I
on
want to be
it.
here.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So anyway, but anyway, about 4 years ago, I moved to Florida State, where I run the DeVoe Moore Center, which is an applied policy research center. It's a unique in the sense that it has a free market mission, which is very rare. It's an endowed center by DeVoe Moore, who is actually really free market. And it's also unique in that it's actually nested in a university, which is also a Tier 1 research university, much to the consternation of a lot of faculty that are in the College of Social Sciences. Not our economics department, because we have a pretty free market economics department, but certainly urban planning is not so happy, public administration is not so happy, political science really isn't happy. Sociology is like, they think we've gone off the deep end. But nevertheless, it's working out pretty well. But one of the things that DeVoe Moore has been really focused on, he's a land developer. And he's really just thought that the city of Tallahassee in Florida had really gone off the deep end on regulation. And so he's actually, part of what the center is supposed to do is examine this. And it turns out that most faculty weren't interested in that. And I was hired in part to come down and start redirecting the center to be more of that, do more of that research in an applied setting. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit more about this regulatory process. It's sort of like, but we're really going to get into the meat and potatoes of regulation. This is not going to be the high level stuff. And I think it's really important because as we begin to think about policy reform, we think about activism on the local level, and how we engage with local officials, I think we need to understand how the process works. And what motivates a lot of this research is that there's this incongruity between elected officials and staff who really discount regulatory burdens and the private sector who actually has to engage with it that says this is a real problem. I've noticed this not just in Florida. I was chair of my planning board when I was living in Ohio and just heavily invested in a lot of community. And what I saw was this dynamic where elected officials would just think things are going fine, but then you talk to the developer over coffee, after when he thinks it's confidential, he says, this is really terrible. I'm incurring tens of thousands of dollars in costs because I have to comply with these rules and regulations that have nothing to do with the quality of the development that I'm actually trying to pursue. So part of what we've started to do is what we call regulatory mapping. We're actually taking projects and we're actually trying to go through and see what are the steps you have to go through. Where are the delays? Because it's not just you enter the process, there's a delay. There are certain steps that you end up going through, and there's some that are going to be more delayed than others, and then to what extent can we use that to try and think about policy reform. So why I think this is important, and I talked in my comments earlier about Uber, I kind of began to sort of hint at this. I think we are really underestimating not only the value of the criticism that Uber and Lyft sort of provide in ride sharing, but also how this case study of taxis shows us the complete, utter failure of local regulation on almost all dimensions. I mentioned earlier, as I was thinking about this, because I'm trying to figure out how can a taxi company be valued at $50 billion. I mean, I get the whole international part of it, and I get all this sort of stuff. I've been following taxi regulations since the early 90s. I've been following land use regulations since the early 90s. I've given expert testimony in court. Where's the $50 billion coming from? And what it's coming from is the market saying there is a lot of untapped potential in this market. That is, and what they think Uber, Lyft, and the others are going to do is going to be able to monetize that value. This is the inverse of the social costs that come with the regulation, because what is unique about taxis is the degree and the comprehensiveness of the regulation of that personal transportation market. This is where I was sort of poking Jesse a little bit, saying I think you really underestimated what the regulatory process is. Literally, most of these cities have figured out that they are the central planners of personal transportation, and they tweak the regulatory process based on what they think their needs are. So, and they hire consultants that say, why do we have, why does Bowling Green have 16 cabs? They probably hired a consultant to come in, run their regression models, and said, you need 16 cab companies. So they don't let any more in, and they don't let the others out, and then the entire system stagnates because everyone optimizes over the existing model. That's why the cartels, the existing companies, are so entrenched, because they've optimized their business model over the existing regulatory system. The same thing happens in land use planning. Essentially what we did with land use planning when we adopt zoning is we collectivize the entire land market. It now becomes subject to government control. I would say public control, but it's government control, because the public actually has very little to do with what actually happens in the planning and land development process. So this is as an example, this is actually a framework that we can export with some tweaks and some changes to looking at land use, because essentially we have a collectivized system of land development. And essentially what the development companies do is they optimize over the existing regulatory structure. And what Houston is so important for us is showing the value that is not being created because of the regulatory process. I mean, so Houston's a huge, and I love listening to Troy. Finally, yes, it's there. Joel and Tori are doing this, and I get it. I don't have the time to do it, and they're doing it, which is great. So this becomes really important. So then the question is, how do you convince people that this is actually happening in the world of land use and land development? Some of the stuff we've done, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, because we don't have that much time, but give you a hint at this. We actually started looking at shopping centers in the city of Tallahassee. And we said, okay, how long does it take you to get a shopping center permit, commercial permit in the city of Tallahassee? Well, the average was close to 3 years. It doesn't matter if it's a strip mall, a little strip mall, or a larger mall. In fact, this is what I think one of the most compelling data points we get. If under 10,000 square feet, that's not a very big commercial center. I mean, we're basically talking maybe a minor anchor and a bunch of little shops that are maybe your H&R Block and maybe that type of thing. 3 years on average to get permitted. And then if you're getting a little bit bigger, this should actually get longer. As it becomes bigger, it becomes more complex. You should actually suggest that it's going to becomes harder. But it actually dips. And then we get over 100,000 square foot. That's going to be a pretty decent sized commercial center. It actually goes up again. But what this suggests is it's the process. It's not really connected to public health benefits or that type of thing. A lot of things that economists would argue that would justify regulation, like externalities. And then when we sort of looked at it, we also found that their permit approval times could vary significantly by year. So in other words, the average approval time was 169, this is days, in 2003, then it dipped in 2005. By the way, this was the housing bubble. You would expect that commercial development would be trying to catch up to the residential market, and so you'd expect more activity. It begins to dip, but actually have less activity, and then it begins to come up again right here. And then, all this inconsistency, really what it is it's indicting the process. So part of what we're going to try and do is take individual shopping centers and sort of go through and see what were the individual problems. But what we were able to show in the study was that if in fact regulation is following an economic rationale, you would have predictable patterns in permitting. You would expect more complex projects to take longer. You'd expect those projects to be focusing on specific issues like stormwater runoff or whatever it might be. We didn't see that in this research. We really began to get into the nuts and bolts of this when we looked at a cell phone tower. You might think that this is an odd thing to look at, and actually I first did as well when this sort of came on my radar screen. This is cute little thing here, and it's fuzzy. It would just be permitted right away, right? But anyway, but this really is very illustrative of the kind of regulatory process certain things are subjected to. Notice where this is located. It's not near a busy street. It's not near a school. It's actually a little bit more complicated than that picture suggests, because if we, it's actually this property here. It's located where the arrow is. This is actually an interstate highway. So if you have a 300-foot tower at sort of flops over, you're going to get one of the lanes in this particular case. It was originally located here. They objected because this is an exit ramp, and they moved it over here. But the important thing is that all of this is privately owned property. This is actually owned by DeVoe Moore, and which is actually was essential for this research because DeVoe Moore is the best research assistant I have ever had in 25 years of academic work. He documented every single meeting that he had with the city of Tallahassee getting this permitted. Over 120 meetings. All right, 120 meetings. And not only that, he had a business partner that was he actually didn't go in to get the permits. He had his business partner go in to get them, go into the meetings. So people didn't know that this was one of the wealthiest guys in actually the state. It turns out. But also notice that this is the construction of it right here. So we've got the cement pylons, and it goes up right there. And notice that the structure is not particularly bulky. And the city of Tallahassee has permitted dozens of cell phone towers. The construction value, as listed on the permit, is $60,000. So not exactly something that's going to break the bank. Frankly, DeVoe could probably write a check for it, right out of his checking account. But it's also, this property here is actually DeVoe Moore's property. This is not a public or a community building or anything like that. Something that will become important in a minute. He does have a herd of water buffalo that's on this open space out here. That's another story, which is kind of funny, but this is Florida is one big wetland, so we have a lot of wetland here, that type of thing. But it's a cell phone tower. It's going up 175 feet in the air. So what kind of things would you expect someone? What sort of hurdles would you have to overcome with this? Noticing, again, basically this is going to be the circle. The worst thing that could happen is a cell phone tower falls over. So it could damage his building, nobody else's building. It could damage, it might be able to go on the exit ramp and sort of block the exit ramp. I'm not aware of any cell phone tower falling over in Tallahassee, ever. So I don't think it's even recorded. But essentially that's about it. Well, because this, and by the way, Tallahassee's cell phone permitting procedures is not that much different from what you find in almost any other city. You have these boilerplate model permitting processes that are just adopted. Go to the American Planning Association website and they'll give you these model ordinances.
Yes.
And then you'll implement them. So what DeVoe had to do, of course you have the first contact, then he had to get certification that this commercial use was in compliance with the land use map, so that it wasn't putting commercial on residential or on something else that wasn't, or agricultural conservation. So you had to get a land use compliance certificate. So it wasn't just a matter of somebody checking off a box. He actually had to get an official permit that said that this is in fact in compliance with the land use map. Then they had to do a concurrency application. In other words, concurrency is when you need to make sure that public infrastructure is there to provide to support whatever development you're going. So apparently they're expecting a lot of cars to come through this. Or I don't know, maybe it's going to, the cell phone tower's going to have kids and send them to schools or something like that. But he still had to get the concurrency application. Then they had to do a natural resources inventory. What kind of plants, what kind of are going to be disturbed or changed? What kind of animals are going to be? I mean, we have a big thing with turtles in Tallahassee, so I mean, all of that had to be part of it. So they had to do a complete inventory of that area about the size of a bungalow to the cost of thousands of dollars. Then they had to submit the site plan. Then they actually had a development or regional impact committee meeting. Yeah. So because now you have to have a committee looking at to make sure this is not going to change something. Then you actually get the site plan. Yeah, this really complicated thing here has to now go to a committee and get approved. And then environmental management permit. Are you actually going to manage this property in a way that's consistent with the environmental goals of the city of Tallahassee, Leon County, and the state of Florida? Then you get to get a building permit application. So once you've gone through all the land use, and then you get a certificate of occupancy. This process took 2 years. We're literally talking about tens of thousands of dollars It's not the actual cost of the permit. It's the time and resources that are used to actually develop, to go through the process. Most people don't do it. Or they're going to move someplace else. And in fact, the reason DeVoe does it, in part, is because he wants to reveal all of this. He wants to show all of this and actually document it. And I've even talked about the fact that at a number of different times we've been with that documentation, they objected to this because they said, well, Tallahassee doesn't need another cell phone tower. What he was doing, this tower was actually introducing new wireless technology into the region, but planners who have no background or expertise in telecommunications, in fact, federal law prevents them from using that as a criteria for evaluating a cell phone tower, but they would insert that anyway as part of the process. They actually they were required at one point to do a demand analysis for the cell phone tower before they could actually get the permit. By the way, this is also important because it's a really important warning sign, because Florida has been among the most aggressive states in growth management and land use planning in the country. This, if you want to look at what your world would look like if the state controlled land use planning, take a look at Florida, because it was top down. It was considered a model until it was considered a model for the nation until the Tea Party came in and swept it away, parts of it away. Anyway, at least at the state level. All right. So what are the implications that we found that are important? It's not it's not just cell phone towers, shopping centers. It's also residential. We've seen this in California, Illinois, any place where we've seen these kinds of highly regulated areas. For one, you quickly get to the point where only the big boys play. Just small developers, small builders are just squeezed out of the process. You don't have the capital, or the time to be able to do this, let alone having the expertise or the ability to interface with professionals and staff. So that it really reduces the dynamism, it reduces the potential of innovation in the market, and it also has a result of lowering overall investment. Obviously, we have higher costs. The ones who are successful are the ones who have local connections to local officials, basically creating a recipe for cronyism. At one point, DeVoe was talking to one of the elected officials, a commissioner, and talking about the problems, and the commissioner said, well, why didn't you just come to me? And I would have taken care of it. And he said, that's the point. The point is that anyone with a good idea should be able to establish a business and expect a reasonable, efficient, transparent regulatory process. And that's not what you get. And none of this is visible. That's why the title of this is The Hidden Cost. And it's invisible for a couple reasons. One, by the time you go through that, you don't want to talk to anybody about it. You just want to get it done. The other part of it is if you talk about it, then you become a target of the officials. And so if you want to continue to do business, and that's why I have so much respect for DeVoe Moore. I mean, he admits it. He talks to my students in my class. He says, the reason I do this is because I don't depend on the city anymore for my livelihood. I have enough money that I can go through this process and they can shut me down and my kids are taken care of. I can still give another $20 million to FSU. I can still do all this sort of stuff. Most people are not in that position. And so he's really, anyway, that's, I have hope. Anyway, so where do we go from here? Is there a way out of this abyss? Unfortunately, my rational brain tells me that once you've got these processes and frameworks in place, there's very little you can do because the system gets entrenched. Why are we having these, why are we seeing the changes in transportation in taxi markets? It's not because the people in the market itself have created that change. It's because you basically had a bunch of tech people who knew nothing about transportation, saw a market, figured out a way to monetize it outside the system, and then blew it up. So the idea would be able to go back to, actually even further back to Houston, but I'll take Houston at this point. And maybe we can. Maybe we can use Houston in opportunity urbanism, and we can find some of the stuff that Scott's coming up, and this will create a case for change that will resonate with some people. We have to start at some point, and we're probably going to get some successes. Those successes will then build into, hopefully, a movement. So it is possible. And I'm an optimist because I do policy. I have to be, or else there's no point. But it is very difficult for local governments to pull back once they've stepped in. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the second best is to try and do two things, I think, and I'll have to stop here. One is we have to remove as much discretion from the process as possible. So by making this transparent, making it very clear what hoops you have to jump through, requiring performance measures for local regulators. So in other words, you can't just delay something for 30 or 40 or 60 days. But make it very clear, for example, if you're doing a telecommunications tower, whether or not that technology is appropriate is something not for you to decide. So you have to back out of that. And that can't be part of it.
In Houston, we've started calling that checklist permitting, meaning
Okay.
it's a simple checklist. If you met the checklist, you're approved. There's no discretion.
Yep.
There's no boards that debate. It's like you either met the checklist or you didn't meet the
Yeah.
checklist.
So these administrative processes, they can be done. They can be designed that way. And I actually, when I was at Reason Foundation, we would work on that part of it. But the other part, which I think is completely missing in this, the whole discussion, but it's become very clear to me over the last 4 years, we need to tie these administrative decisions directly to fundamental principles. In other words, the city has to commit to efficiency. It has to commit as a matter of principle to expediting and making sure that these processes aren't delayed. So you need two things. Staff and administrators need to be limited in terms of their discretion, but there's always going to be discretion. How do you interpret whether the size of that development is going to impact the environment or not? The other part is it has to be tied to principles. And those are policy decisions. Those are not bureaucratic decisions or administrative decisions. And then if we do that, then we can, and then also I'm going to have to stop here, that it should be impact, not impact. But anyway, at the end of the day, what we need to do is focus on what people care about, and that's the actual impact. Nobody was impacted by the tower, so why was the city even worried about it? But there are times when a tower will be in a residential neighborhood, and there will be impacts. So we have to think about that too. But I have to stop right here. Thank you for this opportunity.